United States of America, we face a current problem with drug abuse that needs to be solved. But are we doing it right? Currently, according to an article published by Time magazine, the US is suffering from the worst addiction epidemic in American history. In 2016 alone, an estimated of 64,000 Americans died from opioid overdose. That's more than the combined death tolls of Americans in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and the Iraq wars. The way that the United States is attempting to solve this drug problem is through criminalization. This means ban all drugs and persecute anyone who has them. That obviously isn't working. So what if I told you there's a better way to solve this problem than throwing people in jail? I propose we decriminalize drugs and treat addiction and drug abuse as a disease instead of a crime. First off, I have to convince you that addiction and drug abuse is a disease. Merriam-Webster defines disease as a condition of living animal or plant body or of one of its parts that impairs normal functioning and is typically manifested by distinguishing signs or symptoms, and defines addiction as a compulsive, chronic, psychological, physiological need for habit-forming substances, behavior, or activity having harmful psychological, physical, or social effects, and typically causing well-defined symptoms such as anxiety, irritability, tremors, and nausea upon withdrawal or abstinence. Now, if we compare those definitions, disease needs to impair normal functioning and have distinguishing signs or symptoms for something to be classified as a disease. So when we look at addiction, it both impairs functions and has distinguishing signs or symptoms. As an addiction, and I quote, is a compulsive, chronic, psychological, or physiological need for habit-forming substances, behavior, or activity having harmful physical, psychological, or social effects. So it already impairs functions. And in addictions, on its second half of its definition, it's typically causing a well-defined symptoms such as anxiety, irritability, tremors, or nausea upon withdrawal or abstinence. So we know that both addiction has signs and symptoms and impairs normal functioning. Now I know what you're thinking. Those are just definitions. There's so much more to life than just definitions, right? Well, what if I told you that doctors agreed with me too? According to the Center on Addiction, an article was published on April 4th, 2017, stating, addiction is defined as a disease by most medical associates, including American Medical Association and American Society of Addiction Medicine. Like diabetes, cancer, and heart disease, addiction is caused by a combined of behavioral, environmental, and biological factors. Genetic risk factors account for half of the likelihood of an individual will develop an addiction. Now, the number one reason people will not put addiction or drug abuse as a disease is because of choice. Now, the main reason many believe addiction is not a disease is because of choice. They choose to do drugs, therefore it's not a disease, right? Wrong. One disease that plagues about half of Americans is heart disease and can be started with a few choices. According to the CDC, the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, it states a few choices that can lead to heart disease is high saturated trans fats, and cholesterol, not getting enough physical activity, drinking too much alcohol, and tobacco use. Yet we still accept the disease as a disease. So it's time for America to accept addiction as a disease as well. The way that we can solve this problem is, instead of throwing people into prisons, is use rehabilitation centers. According to Dual Diagnosis, if only 10% of drug-addicted offenders received drug rehabilitation instead of jail time, the criminal justice system would save $4.8 million compared to its current cost. This is because most individuals in jail for drug charges are repeat offenders, causing us to pay more money for judges and courts. Second, it would help people. We need to stop throwing individuals into cages and throwing away the key. This isn't helping anybody. If we were to rehabilitate people, they would be able to become functioning members of society. We should be treating addiction as a disease and not as a crime. Third, countries have decriminalized, there's other countries that have decriminalized drugs. For instance, Portugal. In 2001, Portugal was the first country to decriminalize drugs and treat addicts as patients instead of criminals. Before this, they had the highest rate of HIV in the Europe Union, with 1% of their population addicted to heroin and prisoners packed to the brim with inmates. According to Time magazine, in Portugal, meanwhile, the drug-induced death rates has plummeted to 5% lower than the EU average. It stands at 1/5 of the United States death rate. Its rate of HIV infection dropped from 104.2 new cases per million to 4.2 cases per million. Drug use has declined overall from 15 to 24-year-olds population, those that were most in risk of taking drugs, while the percentage of people in prisons in Portugal for drug law violations decreased from 44% to 24%. Switzerland has also followed Portugal and found the same results. According to North Carolina Health News, over the past 2 decades, a number of opioid-related deaths in Switzerland has decreased by 64%. The number of HIV infections has also dropped significantly. In 1986, more than 3,000 people tested positive for HIV in Switzerland. In 2017, less than 500 people tested positive for HIV. In conclusion, we need to be helping these individuals instead of putting them away and not helping them at all. If we were to help these individuals, we'd be saving money, we'd be helping individuals, and it's the moral right thing to do. So please, let's help addicted and drug abusers. Thank you. Oh my god, it's still on! Oh, why isn't it stopping? Oh.